Hi, I'm Charles London, and I love bread. I love baking bread. So many people have told me, especially after eating my bread, that they wish they could bake bread, but it's just so hard. I'm here to tell you it really isn't. You can do this. And today we're going to bake a loaf of bread together that you're going to love. We're going to bake this Homestyle Country White. It's got a beautiful, crisp yet chewy crust and holes that are just the right size for a spread of softened butter or the mayonnaise on a perfect sandwich. When you make this bread for yourself and your friends and your family, you're going to feel like $1,000,000 because you did something that you thought you couldn't do. And you're going to realize that the best kind of food in the world is in your own power to make for yourself anytime you want. So let's go ahead and make some bread together. Now, this bread is super simple because it really only has 4 ingredients. We've got good fresh water, kosher salt, instant yeast, which is great because you can add it right to the flour and you don't have to mess around by dissolving it in water first, which is always a mess, and bread flour from one of my favorite companies, King Arthur. Baking is about accuracy. It's about knowing exactly how much ingredients you've got and being able to control those ingredients carefully. That's why we're going to bake with a scale instead of by baking with measuring spoons or tablespoons, because when you bake by volume, like with a measuring spoon, you're never really sure how much you have in there. It could be compressed, it could be fluffy, and those little errors actually can be the reason why your baked goods don't come out the way you expected. It's amazing how many mistakes and how many disappointments are due to the fact that people are baking with measuring cups instead of scales. So get yourself a nice scale. They're really not very expensive, and I'll put some links at the end of this video onto how you can get a good one for not too much money. So the first thing we're going to do is get our water together. Now, one of the nice things about this recipe is that we're not going to use a mixer. Maybe you've got a mixer, and that's great, but for the people who don't, this bread recipe just requires a bucket and your hand. Super simple. I love these buckets. They're called Cambros, which is actually the name of the company that manufactures them, but it's sort of like, Kleenex is applied to all tissues. Cambros are sort of a generic name. You can get them at restaurant supply stores, and I'll give you the link for where you can get it in the San Francisco area, but they're available online. The best part about these are these markings that show how much they're holding, because they will allow you to really tell whether your dough has risen enough. Has it doubled? Has it tripled? It makes it super easy to go and see what's going on inside. So we're going to start by measuring our water. We're going to put our bucket on our scale, and then we're going to cancel out its weight so that we're weighing only the weight of the water. And notice we've got our recipe written down on our handy dandy post-it. Don't wing it. Don't do this from the seat of your pants. You're not going to remember the numbers. So we need 334 grams of water. So I'm just going to pour that in until I get pretty close. Almost there. And if you're 1 or 2 grams off, it's not the end of the world. Right? You're still going to be way more accurate than if you had used a cup and a measuring cup and held it up and, is it on the line? Is it below the line? Is it above the line? I hate that. So 334 grams of water. There we go. So we're going to set that aside. Now we're going to cancel out our scale. Always remember to reset your scale. And we're going to measure our flour. So we're going to get ourselves a nice little stainless steel mixing bowl. Cancel out the weight of the mixing bowl, and we need 520 grams of flour. Now, this part, as you're heading up towards 500 grams, you can kind of dump it, which is what I'm doing. Dump, dump, dump. And there we go. We're headed to 400, and double check, 520. And here's why we do it in a in a mixing bowl, because I just blew over it and I'm 8 grams over, and I can just scoop some out. Scoop it out. There we go. 520. It's very satisfying to be able to be right on target like that. So now I'm going to cancel out the weight of that flour, And now I can just add the yeast right in on top of it. It's another nice thing about scales. So we need 5 grams of yeast. I'm just going to sort of shake it like I'm shaking salt. And it's just sort of, don't rush, you'll get there. 5 grams. That's it. Super simple. And now, scooch it around a little bit. Now we're going to leave the salt for later. And the reason for that is, if we put the salt in the dough now, that dough is going to get real tight earlier than we want it to. We want to go through a process where we let the salt, where we let the flour and the water and the yeast all get to know each other, and then we'll put the salt in. Another reason is that salt kills microorganisms, right? Salting is a way to preserve food. You can salt pork and you can salt pickles. Yeast is a microorganism. And the last thing we want is for that yeast to get hydrated and wake up in a salty environment and kind of get a slow start. So we want to give that yeast a fighting chance to wake up. So we're going to deal with that salt later. So we actually need a second amount of water. This is going to be the water we dissolve our salt in, and that makes it a lot easier to get the salt evenly distributed into the dough. So we're going to cancel out the weight of our little pinch pot, and we're going to use 40 grams of water. I'm going to be very careful here. 38. Bloop. 40. All right. And now we're going to cancel out the weight of the water, and we're going to add our salt. And I like to just sort of do this with my fingers. Now, there's a reason why I'm using kosher salt. By the way, we need 8 grams. Kosher salt doesn't have any iodine added to it. There are other qualities that make kosher salt nice, but in this case, this is the most important reason. Iodine is also a antibiotic and a preservative. That's 8 right there. And we don't want iodine to kill our yeast. So a lot of table salt is what they call iodized. Don't use that. You're going to be disappointed. So you're going to notice that if you stir this around, it's only going to kind of dissolve. So what we're going to do is we're going to zap this in the microwave 30 seconds at a time until this gets all dissolved, and then that'll be just right for us. Here's our water, and here's our flour, and we're going to just, there, you can't see anything with that thing there, and we're going to just dump it in. Just dump it right in. And now we've got a spatula. I like a silicone spatula because it's easy to clean off, and we're just going to mix this up. Just mix it up. Now what we're looking for here is something called shaggy mass. Shaggy mass. And that's what bakers call this step. And when you see it, you know why. It totally looks like a shaggy mass. And so I'm going to scrape. That's all it took. I mean, that wasn't very much at all, right? This is my dough scraper. This is my best friend when I'm baking. It's got like a little rounded edge and it's got a sharp edge, and I can use the sharp edge to get stuff off. So now I can just use that sharp edge and I can go around and scrape down the side of the bucket, and I'm just gonna turn it and scrape it and just get everything sort of all worked together, and like that it's turning into a dough, like a dough I recognize. Smells like bread. We're making a 2-pound loaf. It's a pretty big loaf. But you're going to look in here and you're going to look at this dough and you're going to be like, I don't think that's going to be a very big loaf of bread. Until you remember, it's going to rise. It's going to get big. Essentially, we're making a balloon you can eat. And there we go. Now that needs to rest. It needs to rest 20 to 30 minutes. That's a stage we call autolyse. What's actually happening is the proteins in the bread are reacting to each other and the water, and they're actually starting to bind and connect and tangle up and forming the very first structure that's eventually going to be that sponge that holds everything together and holds in the gas and lets all that balloon blow up. All right, so we'll come back in about 20 or 30 minutes and see how that does. Okay, so about 20 or 30 minutes have gone by, and as we open up our dough, we're going to see that it really is doughy now, right? It's not as soupy and sticky as it was before, which is really amazing when you think of that we didn't really need it at all. That was just time and water. So we're going to take the salt water that we made when we were measuring things out. This is just a little bit more water. It's called for in the recipe with the 8 grams of salt added to it. And the reason we do this is so that the salt is much easier to get incorporated into the dough. We could have put that salt in the dough right with the flour, but it would have inhibited the yeast growth, as we talked about before. So we're going to just dump that in. Super easy. And now we get to do what we maybe remember from kindergarten or nursery school. We kind of play Play-Doh here, and you kind of just smush it all around, and it makes this kind of gross, like, splorping sound. And you really, there's no time to be gentle. You want to really squeeze it and smush it and make it ooze through your fingers. Bread makers, this is the time to get over any phobias of having sticky stuff on your hands. It'll all wash off. And it's going to get super sticky. And that's what's happening right now. It's getting sticky, and there's this sort of thick liquid that's forming on the bottom, and the dough is feeling like it's falling apart into like little balls and bits. And this is when often people are like, oh, this is going terribly wrong. Nope, it's all going right. It's just that some of the dough is incorporating with the water and some of it isn't. So you just keep working it and keep working it. And eventually, it's going to start getting elastic. And so if you find parts of the dough that are super wet and other parts of the dough that are super sticky, try to squeeze those together and just get it all even. You really can't overwork this dough at this point. This type of dough is really made. You could do this in a mixer. It would be just fine. And but I wanted to do a version for people who don't have mixers, because the whole point of this recipe is anybody can make bread. You don't need a lot of special equipment or anything like that. All right, so now I'm going to lift it up, and you're going to see just how elastic it is. Ugh. And so what you want to do is you want to lift it up and let it hang and fold it over. And lift it up and let it hang and fold it over. And just keep folding it over. Ideally, you're doing this with one hand, because whichever hand you do this with, it's going to get super gunky and sticky. But eventually, what happens is the bread starts becoming really dough-like, and it starts pulling it off your hands, and your hands start to come a little more clean all by themselves. So you just keep picking it up and wiggling it. You see this wiggle that I'm doing? That helps it stretch out. You want to get this long, stretchy thing and then fold it over on itself. So how many times? Rule of thumb, like 40 times. So we're not going to make you sit here and watch me do this 40 times. So let's fast forward into the future. 35, 36, 37, and what I'm doing is I'm sort of letting it peel off my hand each time. 38. You can be rough with it. I guess some of you don't like it work. 39 and 40. Okay. And you could do more. I find 40 is pretty good. Ick, right? So, happy dough scraper to the rescue. Just do all the sides of your fingers. Because that's bread, right? You don't want to lose that. That's like half a slice of bread right there. Someone's going to like that. Your wife or your daughter or your husband. Someone's going to want that. All right. So there it is, right? In the bottom of our bucket. Kind of lonely down there. So there's a bunch of stuff stuck to the side. We're going to scrape around, try to get that off. Don't worry, you're not going to get it all. And now we're going to transfer it to a smaller bucket. Now, we could have done this all in one bucket. You could totally leave it here. It's fine. But I'm moving it to something smaller so that as it rises, it sort of moves faster, right? The narrower it is, the faster it'll move per time. And we're going to put it in this other bucket just so it's easier to track. I like having a couple of different sizes of buckets. As my wife can tell you, I like having lots of equipment. You don't have to. You don't need a bucket like this. You know, you could have done this in a pot. You could have done this in a mixing bowl. Obviously, you need to put it into something like a bowl. But try to get it kind of flat. Flat as you can get it. Scrape. Kind of get it stuck to itself so it comes off. And now, this is what we call the bulk fermentation. This is the rise. When you hear about bread rising, this is really the first time it's going to rise. What we want to do is sort of get an idea of where this is. This is, for me, it's at the 1 liter mark. Whatever mark it is, sometimes you can put a piece of tape here so you don't have to remember. Come back when it's twice as high, when it's doubled. How long will that take? Well, it's a little iffy. Probably about 90 minutes. Right? If your apartment or your house is really warm, it might take less. If your apartment or your house is really cold, it might take more. More is fine. If it's less, if it's really less, you come back in like 45 minutes and it's doubled, do that folding thing we did just now, like 2 or 3 times to punch it down, put it back in and let it double again. We want to give it at least 90 minutes because the slower this happens, the better the flavor is. So we'll come back here in about 90 minutes and do some more. All right, well, it's been about 95 minutes, which is exciting for me because we're right on target. And if you look, you can see that it's really risen. It was about here, and now it's about here. And when you open it up, it's glossy and oh, it smells all yeasty, and it's really, really delicious looking. And so what we're going to do now is called turning it. The purpose of turning it is essentially to work the dough a little bit and build more structure and drive out some of the gas and let it rise a second time. Bread like this rises twice. So the way we do this is we're going to just get our hand a little bit wet. Obviously, if we were in the kitchen, I would just run it under the water. And I'm going to scooch it down behind and kind of grab the bottom of it and pull it up and over. And I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, up and over, and it deflates right away. Up and over, and up and over, and that's it, 4 times. And go around and scrape off the little bits that are still stuck to the side. It's a little sticky, but you're going to notice immediately just how silky and bread-like and beautiful this dough has become. And all it's done is just sit here, right? It hasn't just risen. It's been conditioned a little bit by this time. And that's it. And now we're going to let it rise again. And so you can sort of see what's going on here. And we'll be back when it's doubled, maybe another 60 minutes. It's going to go faster this time because the yeast have reproduced. So there are more little wee beasties at work this time than there were last time. So we'll see you in about an hour. So the second rise is now finished. And as you can see, it's huge, right? It's a big, beautiful doubling. It's actually kind of 2.5. And that's okay. You don't want to let the second rise get too big because you want to save some of that gas creating capability for what's going to happen in the oven. It's something we call oven spring. As the bread gets warmer and warmer in the oven, the yeast start having a party and getting really, really excited right before they, at 104 degrees. But until then, they really want to, have a ball and produce a lot more carbon dioxide to give you that last lift. And if they've blown it all in the bucket, that might not happen. But we're still okay here. And it smells so good. So what we're going to do now is move on to the step called proofing. Is we're going to shape the loaf, put it in the loaf pan, and let it rise one last time. So if we ever want to get this out of the loaf pan, we're going to want to have to oil it. And you can use butter, you can use baking sprays. Some baking sprays are actually really nice. Baking sprays are actually a combination of non-stick element like lecithin and oil, and often they have a little bit of flour in there. Pam makes a pretty good baking spray. I don't really like them because the propellants have stuff in them. I don't know what it is. So I like to just use good old oil. The oil that you use, because we're going to bake at a high temperature, needs to have two qualities that are important. One, it needs to be kind of flavor neutral, unless you like that flavor, right? So you're going to want to stay away from oils like sesame oil or olive oil, which have a strong flavor. And it also needs to be something that can really handle high heat and not have its flavor change because of that, which also rules out olive oil. So what we call the smoke point needs to be high. Sunflower oil, I think that's ideal. It doesn't have any of the questionable health benefits of canola. Rapeseed, that's okay too. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use that dough scraper that we've been using, which is actually pretty flexible, and we're going to use it to get this dough out of the bucket. Now, what you want to do is not beat this dough up too much as you're getting it out of the bucket, right? You've done all this work to get all this gas in there, and we want to try to keep as much of that in there as we can. We also don't want this bread to stick permanently to our cutting our wood board here, which is really my dining room table. And so we're going to put some bread flour down. Now there are some bread recipes where you just stick it right down onto the wood and scrape it up. This isn't one of those. You don't want to really fight with it that much. So you're going to tilt it, and you're going to take your dough scraper sharp side down. So and by down I mean against the side, so that you can get in there. And you're going to sort of cut around the top of the dough just to get it unstuck. And you're going to go all the way around, and then when you're about halfway around, you're going to kind of scrape down the bottom, and then you're going to go under and lift the whole thing out. And sometimes it can be a little bit resistant like this one is, but that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And you got a blob, right? You get a little bit stuck in the bucket like this, don't worry. Just pop it right back on there. Doesn't really matter. Now, we got the sticky side up, right, and the flour side down. So what we're going to do is we're going to get under there, and if it sticks, that's what your dough scraper is for. Just give it a little scrapey, and we're going to flip it over on itself so that the sticky side's inside. Now we got floured side and floured side, all right? So now what we want to do is kind of stretch this out into a kind of a rectangle. We're going to do something called an envelope fold. And an envelope fold is one of many folds that you can do with bread. The whole point of all these folds is to create tension. We're trying to make the dough tense on the outside so that it has a nice structure and it blows up nicely when it rises. So there we go. And so the envelope fold's pretty easy. You're going to fold it about a third of the way in this way. And then we're going to fold it a third of the way again. And then we're going to fold the back over itself, and then we're kind of, this is the tricky part, you're going to flip the part nearest to me away from myself, and you get kind of a log, and then you're going to drag it back towards you. I'm taking the dough scraper and I'm putting it down hard against the board, and I'm scraping it towards me, and that's producing tension. I don't know if you can see that, but it's kind of making this whole thing bulge up, and that's what seals the seam on the bottom. We're going to take our loaf pan and seam side down, just lay her in there, give her a little push. I've got a pretty big loaf pan here. Yours might be smaller. If it doesn't quite reach the edges, just give it a little push. This dough is going to be pretty tense right now. It's going to want to spring back. That's going to relax. Don't worry if it doesn't get in all the corners. The next step is that we're going to let it proof, and it's going to swell up and fill out more of the space in this loaf pan. So we're going to give it a proof. It should be about double. So you're looking probably at another 30 to 60 minutes. What you're looking for is for the bread to rise up till it's just peeking over the edge, right? So you might have to want to get down the side and look this way, and you want it to be just peeking over the top. The last step here is to take a dish towel and lay it over the top. You might want to take a little bit of flour and just boop, so that if it rises up and touches the towel, it doesn't stick. And just lay it over the top. And what that'll do is that'll prevent the bread from drying out too much, which will make it kind of hard and inelastic on the top, which is not what we want. So we'll come back and see how our sweet little loaf is doing in about 30 to 60 minutes. In the meantime, now's the time to preheat your oven to 425. See you in a bit. Okay. All right. Well, I don't know if you can see it, but the towel is bulging, and if we lift it off, we can see that we've gotten a beautiful proof, a beautiful rise on this lovely loaf of bread. And so the magic moment has finally come. It's time to put it in the nice hot oven. Now, one of the things that we really want to do is make sure that this bread can rise as high as possible. And what's going to happen is that this bread's going to go into the oven, and very quickly the top of this bread will cook. And even though it won't be brown, it will turn into a crust and become inelastic. And so that will prevent it from rising as high as we want it to rise. So this is why bakers put slashes in their bread. It makes a weak spot so that as the bread rises, it splits open in an area that you intended to split open. Sometimes a bread, if it's not slashed, will split open in any kind of area it wants to, and it'll taste great, but it won't always look the way you really want it to. And this is why a lot of loaves of bread have that classic split top. So I've got a very sharp knife. This is actually a meat slicer knife. You could use a bread knife. You could use a razor blade. They sell little things called lames, which I think are sometimes kind of a waste of money. A razor blade or a very sharp knife does fine. And you don't want to make a big cut. You're cutting about 1/8 of an inch. You're just making a weak spot, and you're just going to draw it back, and that's it. All right? And now we're going to put her in the oven. So my oven actually has some pretty heavy baking stones in there. They're commercial grade. You can buy just a pizza stone if you want. For this bread, you don't really need it, but it really does make the oven a lot more efficient, and it keeps the temperature from going up and down too much. And in the future, when we do some of our recipes, that's all about hearth-baked breads. There we go. That's the oven telling us to close the goddamn door. So here we go. We're going to put our little boy in there. If you do have 2 baking stones, put one above and one below. Come on, Duncan. Show our friends the bread. So here we are, a beautiful golden brown loaf. It rose just as I had hoped. You know, after the thousands and thousands of loaves that I've baked, it's never anything but a surprise and a delight to see a loaf of bread pop up like this. It always makes me feel good. And this pan is really quite warm, even with these oven mitts. So what we need to do now is to get that bread out of the pan so that it can cool properly. To do that, you want to check to make sure that it's loose in the pan. Run a thin spatula or a knife around the edge just to make sure it's loose. This is a non-stick pan with sunflower oil on it, so I know it's loose. To do it properly, you turn it over, gently support it on the top crust, and then just lever the pan back. Sometimes it pops up a little bit. That's very nice. And you can see we have a beautiful golden brown bottom crust with a little bit of sheen of oil. Now, some people like an even darker crust, and if you do, depan the bread and then put it back in the oven for about 4 or 5 minutes at that 425, and you'll get a nice color all around on all 6 sides. Now, my wife, who really enjoys this bread, prefers a lighter crust, so we're going to leave it just like this. This is, in my opinion, one of the ultimate sandwich breads. It toasts like a dream. This with butter and jam is really a treat that can't be beat in any way. So there we have it, a nice loaf of country white, what we like to call the Hugo Street Pan Ordinaire here at Family Baking Company. You know, it's an old cliche, but really sometimes the simplest things are the best. And for me, one of the simplest and best things is a slice of fresh baked bread. I love the end. Not everybody does, but for me, the crust is the part that you work the hardest on. And when you take that bread and you have a beautiful piece of softened butter and you have a lovely jam, like this apricot jam, which I think is so complex and sets off the subtleties of the bread in such a beautiful way, you realize that you can make your own life as good as you want to make it. You don't have to rely on anybody else to have a beautiful piece of food. Something that is so mysterious and intimidating and hard to understand is really very simple to make. And it makes your life better, and it makes the lives better of everyone that you share it with. So I hope you make this bread for yourself and for your friends, and I hope you enjoy it very much. Here's to you.